I buried my wife at noon. By sunset, I had no home. The day started cold and gray. The cemetery grass was wet, sticking to my shoes as I followed the casket. 47 years of my life were being lowered into the ground, and I felt like a piece of me was going with her. I stood still while neighbors murmured prayers and my children stood behind me like strangers. The priest said his words, the dirt thudded softly, and the rose I held dropped from my hand before I realized I'd let go. The smell of wet earth filled the air, mixed with the faint perfume my wife always wore. I could almost hear her laugh, see her standing on the porch, waiting for me to come home. Michael, my son, put his hand on my shoulder as they finished. "Dad," he said softly, "come by Sarah's tonight. We need to talk." I just nodded. I had no words left in me. I drove home slowly. The road felt longer than usual, as if the world was stretching away from me. My hands gripped the steering wheel hard, knuckles white. When I turned into the driveway, the first thing I noticed was the porch light. It was off. I had always left it on when we went out. I reached for my keys, tried the lock. The key didn't turn. Confused, I tried again, harder this time. Nothing. I stepped back, staring at the door as if it had betrayed me. Then I saw lights inside. Shadows moved across my kitchen. My kitchen. I knocked. A man I'd never seen opened the door, just a crack. "Yes," he said. "This is my house," I told him. "Not anymore," he said calmly. He opened the door wider and handed me a folded document. I recognized it immediately, a deed transfer. My name crossed out. Someone else's name printed in bold. "Sold." "Who sold it?" I asked, though I already knew. "Your children," he said. 3 days ago. Paid cash. We just moved in. I stood there, frozen, staring past him into the living room where my wife's favorite chair used to sit. Gone. The curtains she sewed by hand had been replaced. The smell of paint and new furniture hit me in the chest. I didn't remember getting back into my truck. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the keys. I drove straight to Michael's house. He opened the door, calm as ever. "Dad," he said, "come inside." I didn't sit. "What did you do?" "You can't live there alone, Dad," he said. "We got a good price. We paid off your debts. This is safer for you." "You sold my house," I said, my voice low. "It's just a house." "No," I said, "it was my life. Your mother's life. And you sold it while I was putting her in the ground." Sarah came from the kitchen holding a check. "This is what's left," she said. I looked. It was barely enough to buy a used car. I left without taking it. That night, I parked my truck in the church lot. I didn't sleep. The heater barely worked, and the cold crept into my bones. I stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how the children my wife and I raised could do this. The next morning, I went to the county records office. The clerk looked at me with sympathy as she handed me the file. Everything was legal. They had power of attorney, signed all the papers, transferred the deed. The buyer? Sarah's husband's cousin. It wasn't just betrayal. It was theft with a smile. I called a lawyer. He said I could fight it, but it would take months, maybe years, and by the time we were done, the house would be gone anyway. That night, I found the cheapest motel I could. The walls smelled of cigarettes, the mattress sagged in the middle, and the ceiling fan ticked like a clock counting down my life. I stayed there 3 days. On the 4th, I drove back to my old house. Parked across the street. The porch light was on now. Through the window, I saw children playing in the living room. My living room. The garden my wife planted was gone, dug up and replaced with bare soil. The rocking chair she loved was nowhere to be seen. I stayed until the sky turned pink, then drove away. I found a small cabin for rent 30 miles away. The landlord looked at me suspiciously when I paid cash, but he handed me the keys. The cabin was falling apart. The roof leaked, the porch sagged, the stove barely worked. But it was mine. For weeks, I didn't answer my phone. Michael and Sarah called, left messages, begged me to come stay with them. I didn't. I spent my mornings fixing the place. First the roof, then the porch. My hands ached, but I kept going. Every nail I hammered was like taking back a piece of my life. I planted a small garden in the back. Tomatoes, beans, herbs. I carved my wife's name into a bench I built from leftover wood and sat there every evening until the sun went down. One day Michael and Sarah drove up. They stood at the edge of the yard like strangers. "Dad," Michael said, "we just wanted to check on you." I looked at them for a long time. "You've done enough," I said, and went back inside. That was 6 months ago. The cabin is warm now. The garden is green. The walls are mine, the bench is mine, the peace is mine. My children sold my house while I buried my wife. But they couldn't sell my will to keep living. And they couldn't take the only thing I still own completely, my freedom. I thought the story ended there. A cabin, a garden, a name carved into a bench. Silence where a life used to be. But grief doesn't stop where you decide. It circles back at night, sits on the end of the bed, and asks if you're sure. The first storm of autumn hammered the tin roof till it sang like a broken drum. I made tea, pulled my wife's old sweater over my shoulders, and opened the cardboard box I hadn't dared to touch since the funeral. Inside were letters, receipts, church bulletins with her neat handwriting in the margins. And tucked under a faded photograph of us on the porch the summer we painted the shutters, I found the warranty and deed from 48 years ago, the day we signed for the house. Her signature looked like it was still wet. Mine shook just looking at it. I didn't sleep. I wrote dates on a yellow pad. Sales figures. Last year's assessment. The good price they claimed. I made columns, drew lines. By dawn I had a number that wouldn't stop burning. They'd sold the house for 42% below the county's low estimate. To a cousin. For cash. I drove to town when the rain quit. The courthouse smelled like dust and copier toner. I filed a records request. The clerk, a woman with gray hair tucked into a clip, looked at the dates, looked at me, and said softly, "I'm sorry." I nodded. There's a kind of sorry that doesn't need reply. At the bank I closed the account Michael had insisted I keep, so bills are simple. There were automatic withdrawals to a property management firm, a phone plan I didn't use, a storage unit I'd never seen. I canceled everything. The manager offered me coffee and a chair. I took both and, for the first time in months, felt like a person in my own life. On the way home, I passed the old neighborhood, then kept going. I didn't want to look at curtains that weren't ours, at a porch that didn't creak the way it used to. I took the long road that winds along the river. The sycamores were already tossing yellow into the water. At the cabin, I sharpened my hatchet and split wood till the sun slid behind the trees. The rhythm steadied me. Downstroke. Crack. Stack. I cooked onions in butter, added beans and tomatoes from the garden, ate standing up, washed the pan, and set it to dry. Simple chores that didn't lie. A week later, a white envelope found my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a photocopy of a text message thread. Sarah's husband and the buyer, his cousin, arguing about how to paper the price difference with contractor invoices that never happened. There was a sticky note in a tidy hand I didn't recognize. For the court, if you want it. I'm sorry. I stared at the paper until the words blurred. Somewhere, someone had a conscience big enough to stamp, copy, and mail the truth. I put the pages in a Ziploc bag and slid them under the loose floorboard by the wood stove where I kept documents that mattered. Then I called Daniel. Daniel was from another life. Work shirts, steel-toed boots, Friday coffees on the way to job sites. He retired to a small town 2 counties over and took the bar at 60 because he said he'd spent a lifetime watching men bully and sign and steal with pens. Now he defended folks who didn't speak fluent paperwork. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he exhaled through his nose, slow and long. "You can't unwind a deed to a bona fide purchaser," he said, careful. "But a sham price to an insider? Power of attorney abuse. We can make noise. Maybe more than noise." "I don't want their money," I said. "I want my name back." He chuckled without humor. "We'll get you something. Maybe the thing you need, even if it isn't the thing you want." We worked. I fetched papers, dates, receipts, names. I wrote a statement 3 times, each shorter than the last, until it told the truth without bleeding all over the page. He filed petitions. The court stamped dates, assigned a judge, scheduled a preliminary hearing. It wasn't a movie. There were no gasps in crowded rooms. There were fluorescent lights, stale coffee, and a clock that didn't hurry for anyone. I went home after the filing and found Michael on my porch steps, elbows on knees, a boy in a man's frame. For a moment the years peeled back and I saw him at 7, skin-knee, eyes too big for his face. "Dad," he said, standing. "Please." The word hung there. Not "I'm sorry." Not "I was wrong." Just "please," a rope tossed into a well. I opened the door and let him sit at the kitchen table. I poured water. He talked. Work had been slow. Sarah's husband promised quick cash. It was complicated. We thought we were helping. "You weren't safe alone." The phrases people use when they need their reflection to look human. I let him get it out. Then I put the photocopies on the table between us. He didn't touch them. "Do you know what your mother always loved about this table?" I asked. He blinked. "The view." "No," I said. "It was heavy. You could knead bread without the table skittering across the floor. It stayed put." I looked at him until he looked away. "You needed money. You needed to feel right. I needed a table that didn't move when life did. You sold that." He wiped his face with his palm. "What do you want me to do?" "Tell the truth," I said. "All of it. In writing." He nodded too quickly. Okay, I'll write something." "No," I said gently. "Not something. Everything." He left with the copies. He didn't hug me goodbye. Winter came early. The river smoked in the mornings, a thin breath over black water. I stacked the splits under the eaves, filled the kindling bin, stitched a new patch onto the elbow of my coat. I reread my wife's recipes and tried to make the ginger cookies as soft as she made them. I failed and ate two anyway. On Christmas Eve, I drove to the cemetery. The ground was hard, the grass sugar-frosted. I brushed snow from her stone and told her the news the way I always had when news mattered. Slowly, from the beginning, stopping where it hurt and starting again when I could breathe. A cardinal landed on the fence and scolded the air. I took it as a benediction and a warning. In January, the judge allowed discovery. Daniel deposed Sarah's husband, the cousin buyer, the notary who couldn't recall whether I'd been present. Nobody remembered the parts that mattered. Everybody remembered the parts that helped them sleep. Michael didn't submit a written statement. He sent a text that said he was working on it, then another that said he was not in a good place. I put my phone in a drawer and went outside to clear snow from the porch. The shovel squeaked on the boards like a boot on gym varnish. The cold gnawed through my gloves until my fingers stung. February, a letter from the judge. The court wouldn't void the sale. It would, however, schedule a hearing on sanctions for breach of fiduciary duty under power of attorney and consider a constructive trust on proceeds. Plain language, the court couldn't undo what was done, but it could punish liars and claw back money from dirty hands. I set the letter on the table and stared at the wood grain until the knots looked like galaxies. Then I went outside and split another stack. The day before the hearing, Sarah came without Michael. She stood at the edge of the yard, boots wet to the ankles, hands in the pockets of a coat too thin for the wind. She didn't speak until I waved her onto the porch. "I'm pregnant," she said. The word landed between us like a fragile box. "Congratulations," I said, and meant it, and it surprised me that I could. She cried quietly, the way people cry when they're afraid of the echo. "I was scared," she said. "We were scared. I thought, if we fixed the bills, if we put you somewhere smaller, you'd be okay, and we'd be okay, and the baby would be okay." Then the buyer wanted the price low for taxes, and my husband said he'd make it right later, and then later never came. She pressed her lips together until color went out of them. I hate the person I was in that house. I poured tea. We drank it leaning against opposite porch posts like dancers who didn't know the steps anymore. Before she left, she took my hand and put an envelope in it. "From the cousin," she said. "He wired us a referral fee. I'm giving you my half. It won't fix anything." She looked at my eyes, not away. "It's not forgiveness I'm asking for. It's permission to try to deserve it someday." When she disappeared down the drive, I went inside and put the envelope on the table without counting it. Some numbers matter less than gestures. The hearing was short and strange. The judge, tired eyes, patient voice, listened. Daniel spoke like a man laying bricks. Even rows, no gaps. The other lawyers smoothed papers and avoided sentences with verbs. The judge asked 3 questions that cut to bone. He found that the power of attorney had been abused, that the sale price was unconscionable, that the cousin buyer wasn't a bona fide purchaser for value in the way the law meant when it said it with a straight face. He ordered Sarah's husband to disgorge profits. He ordered a penalty payable to me. He referred the notary to the state board with a letter whose tone made even me sit up straighter. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the porch that knew my footsteps. It wasn't the bedroom that still smelled, in imagined moments, like her hair after rain. But it was a line drawn in ink on paper that said I hadn't imagined the theft. The world had a word for what had been done to me. Sometimes that's enough to start healing. Spring found me in the garden. I turned the soil with a shovel whose handle had smoothed under my palms over decades. I planted too early and lost the first row to a late frost. I planted again and covered the seedlings with milk jugs I'd cut in half. Every morning, I checked for green like a man reading headlines for a reason to keep going. On Sundays, I started going to the little white church near the river. I sat in the back. I shook hands at the door with people whose names I had to ask twice. After service, I stayed for coffee and cookies that were always a day old, but sweet. I told no one my story. I didn't need to be the man something bad had happened to. I wanted to be the man who put away chairs when the meeting ended. One afternoon in May, I drove past the old street without meaning to. Muscle memory turned the wheel. The house looked different with azaleas blooming where the garden had been. The man who'd told me, "Not your house," was out front trimming a hedge. He saw me, hesitated, then lifted a hand. I lifted mine in return and left before the moment could turn into anything else. At home, a bluebird had discovered the box I'd nailed to the oak. She tilted her head at me like she was giving me a chance to prove I belonged. I moved slow. I earned the right to walk past without fuss. When the baby came, Sarah sent a photo. A dark-haired girl with a serious mouth and a knit cap, eyes closed like the world needed to wait its turn. The message said only, "Her name is June, after Mom's favorite month." I sat on the porch with the picture on my knee until the light went soft and the whip-pour wheels started. I wrote back, "Thank you for telling me. I didn't ask to visit." I made room in me for the possibility that someday she would. The check from the court arrived midsummer. It was more than I expected. Less than a house. Enough to make choices without counting pennies in the canned goods aisle. I paid Daniel in full. I bought a used truck that didn't rattle. I had a new roof put on the cabin and a gutter that didn't overflow in a thunderstorm. I replaced the stove with one that held a steady flame. And then, because grief needs a place to go, I built something. I drew it on butcher paper at the table where truth lay like a quiet guest. A small workshop with a wide door, a window that faced east, a bench at the right height for hands that had learned their limits. I poured a slab with a neighbor's help. We set posts, we braced, we squared, we sheathed. I hung a door that swung without complaint. I oiled the bench and ran my palm over it the way a man might touch a child's hair, astonished that his fingers can still make anything gentle. The first thing I made was a frame. Simple oak, mitered corners, no fancy joinery to prove anything to anyone. I printed the photo of my wife on the porch this summer. We painted the shutters. I set the frame on the mantel. The house breathed more easily with her watching again. August burned the grass to straw. I took to walking at dawn when the mist still clung to the low places. One morning, I found Michael sitting on the bench under the oak where I carved her name. He had a beard now, not the arrogant kind young men wear, but the tired kind that happens when a man stops looking in mirrors. He stood when he saw me. He didn't reach for me. He didn't deliver a speech. He held out a spiral notebook. "I wrote it," he said. "All of it. You don't have to read it while I'm here." I took the notebook. It was heavier than paper has a right to be. He left without waiting for absolution he hadn't earned. I didn't read it that day, or the next. On the third day, I opened it on the bench in the workshop. The first page was ugly, defensive, slippery, a man explaining himself to his own reflection. The second tried harder. By the fifth page, there was a sentence that sounded like my son. I wanted the kind of life where nothing bad could happen to me again, and I decided the way to get it was to make something bad happen to you instead. I stopped and put my palm on the page and forgave him exactly that much, no more. In September, the church needed someone to fix the wobbly pew slats. I brought my tools and a thermos. People who'd learned my name started using it like they were testing how it sounded with theirs. A woman named Ruth made pies that could end wars. A man named Earl had survived 3 wives and 2 heart attacks and laughed like the world's worst secrets were finally harmless. They didn't ask where I came from. They asked if I could stay for soup. When the maples turned like slow fire and the river wore a scarf of fog every morning, I drove to the cemetery again. I told her about June's photo, about Sarah's envelope, about the judge who had a voice like a fence post, plain, straight, where you needed it. I told her I wasn't angry every day anymore. Some days I woke up and the first thing I felt wasn't loss. Some days I felt hungry. I sat on the grass until my knees complained. Then I stood and brushed the damp from my trousers the way she used to for me with a laugh that said I was a man and also a boy, and she loved both. On the way out of town, I passed a thrift store with a sign that said estates purchased. In the window, behind a row of mismatched teacups, was a rocking chair that looked so much like hers my stomach clenched. I pulled over too fast, and stood in the doorway waiting for my hands to stop their old man trembling. It wasn't hers. The scratch on the arm curved the wrong way. But when I sat in it, and it groaned the exact same pitch, some muscle behind my ribs loosened. I bought it. I put it on my porch where the morning light hits the boards and turns them to honey. I didn't sit in it right away. Some thrones require a vow. The first frost painted the garden silver. I pulled the last of the tomatoes, their skins split from cold, and simmered them into a sauce that tasted like endings and beginnings at once. I filled jars, labeled them with the date, and lined them on the shelf like a man stacking proof. On Thanksgiving, the church hosted a potluck. I brought biscuits and jam. Sarah came with June in a car seat and a pan of sweet potatoes with the marshmallows burned in that perfect way only accident can achieve. She didn't sit at my table. I didn't sit at hers. Earl made a joke loud enough for the room, and June startled and then smiled with her whole face the way babies do before they learn reserve. At the end, when we were folding chairs, Sarah walked over and placed June in my arms without asking permission because some permissions come pre-granted in the shape of a life. June's head fit the hollow below my collarbone like the last piece in a puzzle you've been building in the dark. At home, I carried the empty car seat feeling absurd and holy. I set it by the door and stood there too long because in a different life, a better one, that plastic moon would have rocked on our porch while my wife stood with a blanket and her hair catching light like a net. When snow came, it came heavy, erasing tracks, making the world new by pretending it was clean. The cabin held. The roof didn't leak. The stove stayed steady. I woke before dawn most mornings, lit the lamp, and wrote a list on an index card. Split wood, check fence, sand the bench, called Daniel for lunch, bake bread, breathe. I crossed items off with a satisfaction that felt childish and earned. One night close to Christmas, there was a knock. I opened the door to a wind that reached in like an uninvited relative and to Michael on the step with a box. He held it like evidence. "It's hers," he said. "The box with the recipe cards." I kept it. I don't know why. "I'm sorry." He looked away. "I kept it because it smelled like cinnamon." I took the box. It did. Cinnamon and old paper and something else. Something like sunlight that has learned patience. "Come in," I said. He stepped inside, awkward, hat twisting in his hands. We stood like strangers who remembered each other and couldn't decide whether to admit it. I read the notebook. I said. He swallowed. I figured. "You left out the part about the night you changed the locks," I said. He closed his eyes and opened them. "I know. Write it," I said. "Write the locks. Write the smell of paint. Write the part where the man said, 'Not your house,' and you went to sleep anyway." He nodded. "Okay." We didn't hug. We didn't solve anything. He left, and the cold came in, and I closed the door on it. On Christmas morning, I made my wife's ginger cookies again. This time they were soft. I smiled in spite of the ache behind my eyes, and put a plate of them on the porch for the nuthatches because she would have approved of sweetness wasted on creatures that don't need it. New Year's Eve, I went to bed at 9 with a book I didn't finish. At midnight, the firecrackers in town sounded like someone insisting life is still here. I whispered into the dark, "I know," and meant it. In the thaw of March, I found 2 crocuses shouldering aside the leaves at the edge of the path. They looked like mistakes the world had decided to keep. I knelt slow and let my knees have their say and touched the petals with a finger that has hammered nails and signed checks and tried to hold a child who had become a man I didn't recognize. When the rain set in for a week, I pulled the notebook from Michael out again. I wrote in the margins, not advice, not judgment, just dates and places his memory could lean against. On the last page I wrote one sentence. "You were born in a house I built with my hands and a woman who could make soup out of almost nothing. Remember that when you decide who you are next." I didn't send it. Not yet. Some bridges you rebuild plank by plank, letting each board dry before you step on it. And then, because a life is not only the sum of what is taken from you, but also the shape of what you put back, spring unrolled itself like a map of possibilities. I finished the shelves in the workshop and started making small things for the people at church. A frame for Ruth's wedding photo, because her third husband is finally a good one. A step stool for Earl because he won't admit he needs it. A birdhouse for the child who whistles at every hymn. I put a small jar on the bench with a sign that said, "Pay what you can or don't," and learned that some folks' gratitude folds into green and some folds into time, and both spend fine. In April, Sarah brought June to the cabin on a Tuesday when the river was the same color as the sky. We sat on the porch and counted the number of times the bluebird dove like he was trying to argue with gravity. June slept. Sarah watched me watch her and didn't flinch. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said finally. "I'm asking you to go on living where I can see it." "That I can do," I said. Before she left, she stood by the bench with my wife's name and traced the letters with the tip of her glove. "I dream about her sometimes," she said. "She laughs at me and then tells me to eat something." "Then you're dreaming, right?" I said. On the first truly warm day, I opened every window and let the cabin breathe. Dust motes rose like a congregation. I scrubbed the floor until the boards felt ready for bare feet. I set the rocking chair just so, poured coffee, and sat where her head would have rested if she had been the one rocking. I didn't speak to the empty room. I didn't need to. The room spoke to me. In the tick of the stove cooling, in the complaint of the chair when it changed its mind, in the line of light moving across the floor like time explaining itself. I lost my house on the day I buried my wife. And for a long time that sentence was the only true thing I could say. Now I can say other true things. I have a roof that doesn't leak. I have a bench with her name. I have a garden that gives back more than I put in. I have a church with bad coffee and good people. I have a granddaughter who will someday ask where she comes from, and I will tell her the parts that matter and none of the parts that don't. I have a son who is trying to learn the language of repair, and I have a daughter who brought me an envelope before she brought me a smile. The world didn't give me my house back. It gave me a chance to be at home in myself. Some nights I still wake to the sound of keys that don't fit. I sit up, breathe, and remember, the keys I need now are in my chest. I go to the door, open it, stand in the cool air, and listen to the river dragging moonlight downstream. I say her name. I say mine. And I go back to bed in a place that's mine because I built it, and because I stayed, and because I learned the slow craft of not leaving myself when other people do.